Hello, and welcome back to Read the World. My name is Derek Main, and I review translated literature. And today's review is going to be, look at that beautiful cover, Death in Spring by Merce Rodoreda. This is translated from the Catalan by Martha Tennent, and it is from Open Letter. Now, this is an older book, and while I do try to review translated literature from all time periods, in fact, I'm going to start a buddy read soon with some folks from, I think, the 30s. But anyway, it's a little different in that this is still contemporary in terms of release. You know, this was released in, I guess, 2017. Is that right? No, 2015. So even further back. You know, so I mean, it's sort of new. It was originally published in 1986. But the reason that I chose to review this and chose to read it, even though it is widely considered a classic, possibly the classic of Catalanian literature, is I had gotten her new book, which did come out this year, Garden by the Spring. And new book, I mean, she's, you know, passed away. So when I mean new book, her new English release, Garden by the Sea, and this one's translated by Martha Tennent and also by Martha Tennent, also by Open Letter. So I was really excited about it. Actually, it's one of the titles I was most excited about this year. And what happened is I started it the first week of March, I believe, and literally midway through is when we were all sort of sent home, you know. So I really liked the concept. I was sort of into the story. I was into kind of following this rich family and their new neighbors through the eyes of the gardener. And then it just stopped working for me. And I didn't know how much of that is the circumstance. I mean, I've never read a book in that circumstance where I started it in one world and finished it in another. And that other was, I mean, of course, it's always now filled with anxiety, but in the very beginning, as you'll recall, I mean, the unknown, I mean, maybe it's all still the same, but it just felt heightened. I don't know. It was a weird time to read. And I know a lot of readers that had a lot of trouble, and I was just one of them. So I wanted to go back and kind of look at the classic Rodoreda and determine, was it my reading, or was there something about Garden by the Sea that didn't work for me as it kept going? Both? We'll see. So let's go to the classic, right? Death in Spring. But I also think it's kind of a fun time to review it because last year, one of the best movies that came out was Midsommar, and there are parallels between Death in Spring and Midsommar, as well as The Wicker Man, the original, not Nick Cage. And I have watched both of those very recently, read this very recently, so I'm going to discuss that kind of stuff as well. So, brief description, in case you don't know, Death in Spring is a very weird, screwed up village, and we're going to see this village through the eyes of a young man. And the young man will be married, the young man will have a daughter, and sort of relationships with a couple of different people in the village, and it begins with the young man's father dying. We can tell you this because it happens very early, and because I think for anyone who sort of knows about this book, this is the one thing they know. It starts with the young man's father being placed into a tree and their mouth filled with cement, and that is how they kill / entomb him. And that is one of countless things that we would consider extremely weird. And so those are the trees with the souls there, and there's a mythology and a spirituality behind all of those decisions that it gets into. Okay, so let's dive right into the movie comparisons there with Midsommar Wicker Man, and Death in Spring. Okay, so all three, of course, center around sort of pagan, very odd villages, all horror occurring in the daylight. Okay, folk horror is sort of a catch-all phrase you might use. Well, for Midsommar, we have academics coming in, young, naive academics, but academics nonetheless coming in that are kind of it's sort of exploitive. Like, they want to use the freakiness of this village to, you know, for their thesis and for their own work and whatever. So they're kind of like gaping at it in a sense. And the horror of the village is discovered over time. I mean, in the sort of close to the beginning of them arriving, there is a horrific scene, and now we know there's something weird, but you know, that's kind of explained in spiritual terms that we can grasp culturally. But then things just progressively get more and more nuts, okay? And then ultimately Midsommar, aside from the other things we're going to compare about, is really just kind of a revenge fantasy, and it makes it a lot of fun. These other two are not. Alright, so The Wicker Man. Similar to Midsommar, we've got outsider coming in, but in this case it's an outsider investigating. So as opposed to trying to take from the village, they are trying to potentially alter the village by their presence, and they are going to be that outsider that is very skeptical because they are investigating something. Now, this has an even slower build of horror when it comes to discovering what the village is up to. Much more of a like creepy whatever vibe until we get to a big explosive ending where we really determine the depths of the paganism that's going on. And that movie, while certainly it had a lot of influence on Midsommar, that movie is about something different because it is about the clash of paganism and Christianity, and it is a nice allegory for that clash over time as it occurred. So, Death in Spring, one thing that immediately makes it very different is our entry into this world. Our narrator is a member of the village. So, the narrator is not an outsider, okay? Very interesting there. But the narrator is clearly not 100% on board with everything, alright? And the way I started to read this, I felt like the narrator was sort of uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable with what we as outsiders would be uncomfortable with, if that makes sense. The narrator's attitude and tone is more akin to sort of a typical existentialism that you might feel in your own life and culture. So, like, I don't think there's a shock and horror that the narrator feels that we would feel. Instead, I think there's more of a, is this the best way to do things? Is this all there is to life? Is this, you know, how life and death should be structured? So there's certainly a questioning, and I think the narrator is you know, again, they're not shocked and awed at it the way that we are because they're a member of the village, right? And so that is interesting. It's sort of a different approach there. And you get to know the village at a much more personal level, but you're getting to know it from someone who is kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But maybe not always for the reasons that we thought. I should say, I really liked this book. Okay, let me back up before I read for a minute. So my initial question was the issue here? Was it the writer? Whatnot? Okay, well, it's complicated. I think both of these books, there's some big similarities in that the premises are tremendous. I mean, they are film type premises, and both would make incredible movies. I just spent a while comparing this to two classics. Both peter out a little bit in the middle, okay? Now, Garden by the Sea is structured over the course of these years. So as each summer comes, you know, that kind of moves you along fairly well. But frankly, it probably should have been a lot shorter and just sort of hit on the high notes. It lingered on so much at times that some of the summers just weren't interesting enough, right? Okay, and that's that middle part that just kind of lingered, and so what it ended up being was, in my opinion, a much better premise than a fully realized work. Well, now we get to this, which is complicated by the fact that it was unfinished at the time of her death. She worked on it for 20-some plus years, famously, and she did not finish it. So the shortfallings of this, fairly clear in that sense, in that it does feel a little unfinished. Now, it has a satisfying 3-act structure, but the 3rd act a tad weaker, and apparently she had maps and whatnot, like, of the village. I do think that a lot of time was spent on the conception of it, right? And really, like, the mind's eye and the camera view of this village and the strangeness sort of going on. And the philosophy within is kind of akin to, like, even though this is so weird and so screwed up, the philosophical questions you're going to have are sort of the same that you're going to have in your own life, right? And so I think that's a cool sort of way to do it. But one thing that's kind of missing was, and that has to do a little bit with the ending, but there's so much of a focus on the intricacies of the village, and sort of as a reader you get these moments of like shocks and ahas and these really cool little like things with the prisoner and the blacksmith and like all of this like stuff that's very well crafted and put together. Sometimes you are looking for the story. Sometimes you are looking for the meat. Like you see the setting, the table is all set, you see the characters, you're at a dinner with some wonderful people, the conversation is good, and it's like, well, what is this arc though? And I think we can chalk that up to her not being able to finish it. I think we also might be able to chalk it up potentially to an obsession on those other details of setting the table. A writer that really wants to be meticulous about setting the table and perhaps is not as interested in some other elements that, you know, might have enhanced it, right? So I do think that my issue with Garden by the Sea was with the work. And that, yes, it made it harder, the fact that I started and finished it when I did, but I do think that it had a great setup, and it just didn't follow through with it. And I do think the writer in general is as tremendous as everyone says, and that she is wonderful, and Death in Spring is certainly, like, you know, a masterpiece, and a modern masterpiece. Page 18, The Birth of the Village. On a slope, man met shadow, and they never parted. They established the village. The man, the shadow by his side, planted the first wisteria. But that's not exactly how it was. A long time ago, when the oldest of the old men in the village was young, he witnessed the birth of everything. The village was born from the earth's terrible unrest. You know, she had sentences like that that'll just knock you off. I loved that, the beauty of that. Wisteria is a big theme, by the way. Obviously, we're dealing with spring, but another thing that I found interesting. So this is Garden by the Sea. We're getting a lot of gardening. It's from a narrator who is a gardener, and a lot of stuff on flowers and flora, botany, things I know nothing about. And similarly, since we're in spring and we've got this lush village, we get a lot of that here. So one theme we're going to take away from Rodoreda's writing from just 2 works is loves the flowers. Okay, page 63, The Prisoner, one of my favorite characters. Something I would love a critical analysis on what the prisoner was supposed to represent. They they put these prisoners away. I don't think this is included. Oh yeah, it's included in the writing that she's going to do. So let me just read. Only one prisoner remained in the village. Long ago there had been another, and he had lived, they said, twice as long as most people did. The prisoners were thieves. The village only punished thieves, and they punished them by taking away their humanity. The blacksmith built the prisoner's cage. He made it small, just large enough for a person to sit in, but not lie down. The first prisoner had had a wooden cage. Everyone recalled how he passed the time biting his nails until blood spurted from them. Then he would begin to sob. The wooden cage rotted before the prisoner had ceased to be a person, and they were forced to build a new one. The iron one, they said, would last a lifetime. In winter, the villagers placed logs around the cage so the prisoner would not be cold. Everyone loved the prisoner. I have 3 things to say about that. 1, biting his nails until blood spurted from him, then he would begin to sob. That hit a little close to home. The wooden cage rotted before the prisoner had ceased to be a person. This is why you read it. This is why you read her. The last one, everyone loved the prisoner, and that's why I said I'd love some sort of critical analysis on what. So the prisoner are thieves. There's always one. There's been one before. The prisoner plays a big role in this story, which we won't get into because there's lots of, that would spoil much of it. But everyone loved the prisoner. I'm curious, and you wonder how many people in the village are moving along with this strangeness due to simply the cultural history, and how much of our own lives we do the same thing of our own strangeness, although not quite as brutal. Well, scratch that. Just as brutal, different. And loving the prisoner is like another side of that. Like this one narrator who has a sort of weird relationship with the village maybe is not alone. Or maybe everyone loved the prisoner the way you love a pet, because the prisoner was caged, and so you could go up and talk to the prisoner and you know, without any fear, and sort of like also one of those confessionals, certainly that narrator uses it that way, where the priest is behind the whatever, while here the prisoner's behind the iron bars. A lot going on there that I think is interesting. Page 146 is one sentence, and I pulled this out because there's a philosophy here in one simple sentence, and I wondered how much Rodoreda would have known that that was the philosophy she was espousing there through the work, and how important that might be. You can have everything you want, but accompanied by pain, until you learn not to want anything. That's Buddhism. So, you know, desire is, that's the beginning of the Four Noble Truths, you know, and as someone with an interest in Buddhism as a philosophy, and certainly not a very good practicing Buddhist at all, but I found it very interesting that that's tucked away there. It is one sentence, but it is Buddhism, you know, it is the tenet. You know, that if you remove all desire, you have a chance at removing suffering. You can have everything you want, but accompanied by pain, until you learn not to want anything. So, curious, it was really the only place I saw it, but it felt monumental to me because it is such a, it's such a monumental idea that is throughout the Eastern and now Western culture for centuries and centuries and centuries, so it would be known. So how important is that to the work, even though it's only one sentence? How important is it to the author? All right, I'm going to finish off with a reading, my favorite section. And it is incredibly sad. It is about the sadness of being born. And then, before I do that, let me just say my next review, I have finished the work. It is 77 by Guillermo Sacamano, translated from the Spanish by Andrea Labinger, winner of the 2008 Hammett Prize, which I believe he won before for Giselle Dome as well, so a 2-time winner. And this is also open letter, so yes, 2 in a row from the same publisher. I try not to do that, but I'm trying to go through the BTBA long list that I'm very interested in, and this one happened to make the short list. So I picked out 3. Tentacle, which you can see my review of before, by Rita Indiana. That one did not make the short list, but the one I am reading now, Good Will Come from the Sea, did. So 2 of the 3 I picked out that I was interested in and hadn't read made the short list. That's pretty cool, and this will be my next review. Page 114, let's end with this. My favorite section. He is referring to his daughter. When she was born, I had not loved her. She looked peculiar when my wife showed her to me. It was as if a nuisance had settled into the house. I wanted to run away so I would not have to see the thing that clearly I had made, because life is sad. To be born is sad. I could not look at her. Everything had turned bitter, less full of life. Her eyes, her legs, every little bit of the flesh I had made had been made from me. All of it drove me mad. When she cried, I was the one who wished to cry loudly. I would have preferred her not to be born, because I knew what awaited her. Breathing. Only the chore and sadness of breathing, and breathing as things change from tender to dry, new to old. The night moon that grows thin then swells. The fireless sun that lights up. The soughing of wind that transports, shatters, gathers, and drives away the clouds, raising and flattening the dust. Only the sorrow of going to sleep and waking up, feeling life without knowing where it comes from, aware that it will flee without knowing why it was given to you, why it is taken from you. Here you are. This is this and this and this, and now enough. Thank you. Be good to folks.